All right, Chapter 2, The Nature and Extent of Crime. There's 3 lecture videos relative to this chapter. As I've mentioned in the previous chapter, they're kind of condensed versions of materials found in the book with possibly added examples in some places, as well as I want to give you a platform using my slides. As you know, you get a slide sample without the narrative to it, because I think it's very helpful in making notes or condensing the materials in the book. If you print it out, 3 slides per page, you actually get a little notation box on the side where you can make your notes. I think that would be helpful if you are reading through when you're reading through the chapters, and you can put them next to the appropriate slide if that helps you in your study materials. So anyway, Chapter 2. Criminologists, they have a number of extensive and elaborate methods for collecting and analyzing data as it relates to crime and individuals who commit crimes. The data collection is critical to assessing the nature and extent of crime, tracking changes in the crime rate, and measuring factors that influence criminality. And what we are going to discuss in this chapter, we're going to cover the following questions. What are the sources of crime data that criminologists use? What are the current crime trends and patterns? And what or who is considered a chronic criminal? So we're going to start with the primary sources of crime data. And I have links to each one of these databases on Moodle. You'll be needing to access those for one of the assignments this week. And these are the official records. That's what we're going to talk about first. The official records and the surveys that are used. They come from 4 primary sources: the FBI's Uniform Crime Report, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, the National Crime Victimization Survey, and the Self-Report Survey. And we're going to go through each one of these specifically. The FBI, that's where we're going to start with the Uniform Crime Report, the UCR for short. The FBI collects crime data from local law enforcement, from prisons, and the court system. Basically, it's the criminal justice system, the 3 components of the criminal justice system: the cops, the courts, corrections. That's where the FBI collects the data from. It compiles the info and publishes it annually. The yearly of number reported offenses, and it's also broken down: city, county, geographic area. Like if we're talking about the United States, like we are, it might be like in the East Coast, West, the South, and so forth. And it's broken down. It can be broken down into geographic areas. And they do that not necessarily for every crime, but the most serious crimes, or those that are designated as Part 1 crimes. Those are murder, rape, what else is in there? Manslaughter, arson, robbery, assault, theft. Those are deemed Part 1 crimes, or the serious crimes. And the key is that these crimes, I'm going to make this point probably a couple times, the key to this reporting is these are crimes that are reported and arrest made, because sometimes crimes aren't reported, and sometimes, even if they are reported, there's not necessarily an arrest. So that's what we're finding here: crimes that are reported and arrested on the UCR. Other data that's found: characteristics of the individuals arrested, gender, age, race. Also, whether the crime was a Part 1 crime or a Part 2 crime. Now, if it's not a Part 1 crime, it's a Part 2 crime, which is the non-serious offenses, or those, like I said, not designated as Part 1. Some examples, even though there's a huge laundry list, but we might find our drug trafficking offenses here, vandalism type cases, and sex crimes that are not considered rape, and there's a whole slew of them. So now the question is, how does the FBI compile this information? They collect the reported and discovered cases each month from law enforcement, like I said. And like I said, it's based on the actual offenses known. They use 3 methods to express this, and this is found on the website. You'll be able to go and see and calculate one of these yourself. And you can see the results. So there's 3 methods. The first one is the number of crimes reported and arrests made. That's when you see that, that's the raw data that's reported. The number of crimes reported and the arrests made over the course of the year by law enforcement. It's a very big number. It's well over 1 million. And then you can see year over year the percentage changes in the number of crimes. And you can pick a specific crime. So that's what else you can find on the UCR. And it also reports crime rates per 100,000. That's determined in a calculation. So it's the number of repeated crimes divided by the U.S. population times 100,000 equals the crime rate per 100,000 people. That calculation is in the book. I'm not going to do the math here, but that is what you will see when you look at crime rates. That's how they determine what the crime rate is, and you could see that as well. That's the other thing they compile this information for, is the determination of those 3 things. So then the question becomes, is it valid? Is the UCR valid? And it has been under suspect due to a number of reasons. Reporting problems, law enforcement's practices, and the methodology that the FBI uses. Those are the 3 primary reasons that it's suspect, the information. Number 1, let's talk about why. Number of crimes aren't reported. Why? They don't put the reported crimes. So there's crimes that aren't reported that happen that aren't a part of the official report. Why don't people report crimes? Lack of confidence in law enforcement. They don't trust the police. They don't believe the police will help. Insurance plays a role for dealing with theft or damage type crime. Many people think it's pointless to report when they're not covered by insurance. The requirement is because insurance can just, FYI, insurance companies require a police report to be made if you want to collect on damage to your property or that something was stolen. The first question, and if there's insurance, the first question is going to get, did you report it to the police? That's going to be a requirement for insurance. So if you don't have insurance, people think it's pointless to deal with. Fear of retaliation from the offender, especially if the victim is someone the offender knows, or the victim knows the offender, it's a family member. Fear of retaliation. I don't think it's all that important, is another reason. A more serious crime, murder, is likely going to get reported. But some, like if we're dealing with a domestic violence type of case, that's just an example. People might think, well, that's just a private matter. It's not that important. Or nothing will get done about it. It falls into that area of reasoning. Another reason why crimes don't get reported, the term is called, quote unquote, the dirty hands theory, where the victim also is involved in criminal activity, or not just always criminal activity, something that might like less appropriate behavior that they don't want to tend to report. Those who have dirty hands, for example, like a drug dealer who gets ripped off cash, they're not going to report that somebody stole cash from them when they are selling drugs, right? But there's people who have, quote unquote, skeletons in the closet, and those folks tend to not report or get police involved in their matters either. And finally, another reason people don't report is no support. from family or friends, little or none. Why'd you do that? Don't do that. So there's no support. What about the police? Number 2, the police, law enforcement practices. Could be inaccurate reporting or lax reporting. The FBI has guidelines for filing on a crime. So if they don't follow the guidelines properly or they misinterpret them, the police might define a crime as a trespass when the FBI's guidelines might have deemed it a burglary. And rape has a ton of different definitions depending on the state. So sometimes the reporting issues leads to being inaccurate, or it's screwed in some way. The failing to make an arrest altogether, not arresting, so it doesn't get reported. The FBI's methodology has been under attack, and one key attack is that if an incident involves multiple charges, this is a big deal, because somebody can have one incident and there could be a number of charges that can come of that. But when an incident involves multiple charges being filed, only the serious crime is counted for that incident. So for instance, I like the example in the book, an armed robbery. Somebody's in there robbing a bank, let's say, the clerk is injured, and then the suspect flees and steals a car, and while they're driving the car, rams into various other cars and property on the way, causing damage. It's a whole slew of crimes right there, right? We have the armed robbery, we have a clerk being assaulted, we'll say they're injured by an assault. The running away is actually a crime, fleeing the scene, or fleeing police, stealing the car, and then causing all that property. But the only crime that will be reported to the FBI is the armed robbery because it is the most serious. So despite the many offenses there, only one is going to get reported, and it's the most serious one. Now, after all of that discussion, despite those discrepancies, it's actually the Uniform Crime Report is considered a reliable source of information for criminal statistics. So the FBI's UCR is the largest, most common data on crime available. It's also considered a highly reliable indicator of crime patterns and trends. Its objective is to generate reliable info so law enforcement can use it. They use it for what? How they're going to enforce laws, how they handle their administration, or operate and management within not only their agency but in their area. They need to know those things. And when you go and look at the website, you will notice that there's actually 4 databases within the Uniform Crime Report, and that includes the one we'll talk about next in a little bit, the National Incident-Based Reporting System. There's a summary reporting system. There's a report on law enforcement officers killed and assaulted, and there's hate crime statistics program, all built into the Uniform Crime Report. So the National Incident-Based Reporting System, let's talk about that, the NIBRS. This is going to be the future Uniform Crime Report. Let's talk about it here. The National Incident-Based Reporting System was created to improve the overall quality of the crime data collected by law enforcement. This system is different because it collects data on crimes reported to the police and incidences where multiple crimes are committed. So that example we had just previously with the armed robbery, all of those other charges that would get charged would also be reported. And not only that, this reporting system also collects information on the victims, known offenders, relationships between victims and offenders, the arrestees, because you can have an arrestee and then not have a conviction, and property involved in a crime. So it has all of that additional information. And law enforcement provides the information on each criminal incident involving 49 specific offenses, including the Part 1 crimes, meaning there's much more specific detail, and not necessarily is there a need that arrest needs to be made. And under the 49 specific offenses, you don't necessarily need an arrest. And then they have another component where they have and arrest information on 46 specific information and 11 lesser offenses. We're not going to go and pick and go through all of those offenses. You need to know that there's a Part 1, and those are the serious offenses, and the Part 2, the non-serious offenses, are lumped into Part 2. The National Incident-Based Reporting System is much more expansive. So there's a lot more crimes that are covered and reported on this particular system. And this is going to be our future uniform crime report, because it is slated to replace the FBI UCR in actually the beginning of the year, January 1st, 2021. So that is the National Incident-Based Reporting System. You'll take a look at that in this week's assignment as well. And then we have Victimization Studies. And this is kind of the attempt to fill in where the police reports are missing by asking people who have been a victim of a crime in any particular given year whether or not they reported the crime to the police or didn't. And we're going to talk about how that gets done with the National Crime Victimization Survey, the Ncvs. This is the primary source of information on criminal victimization in the United States. This helps fill in the gaps of the UCR and the National Incident-Based Reporting System, because this data, because the former data, the one in the UCR and the NIBRS data, is based on only crimes known to the police. So this adds more benefits to our statistics, because we're looking at it from the point of view of the victims and kind of elaborating on the information from the other two sources. And it is collected by the U.S. Census Bureau. So they're the administrators of the survey, and they gather data on the frequency, characteristics, and consequences of criminal victimization from approximately 200,000 people each year. And this info is based on non-fatal personal crimes. And that seems to be obvious, because if it's fatal, then you can't talk to the victim. Non-fatal personal crimes. So we're dealing with sexual assault and robbery, assault and larceny, household property crimes like burglary, stealing vehicles, and other types of theft crimes, whether it's reported or not reported, because now you are actually talking to a potential victim. And this collects information on age, sex, race, ethnicity, marital status, education level, and income, and whether or not the individual experienced victimization. And it also collects offender information and incident information: time, place, occurrence, was a weapon used, what's the nature of the injury, were there any economic consequences, like you didn't get reimbursed or paid back if you had to pay for it out of pocket, it was damage or a theft. And the data is considered unbiased and a valid estimate. However, do you see any sort of potential problems or challenges or limitations in this type of data? If you're interviewing, if this is coming straight up from the victim. How about the recall the recall of the victimization. Someone's memory of what happened could lead to over-reporting, where there's a lot more facts that may or may not have been accurate, or underleading. I don't remember. Underreporting. I don't remember many of the details. Traumatization can lead to an incident being blurred, or they lie or omit information due to fear or lack of trust or guilt or shame. They're uncomfortable with the person doing the interviewing. These things generally happen face to face. The person's taking down the information. And I told you there's 200. They do this with 200,000 people. Is that responding group representative of the nation as a whole? That could be a problem. The format of questions, not clear enough. They're ambiguous. And just fear of reporting. They may have been a victim of the crime, but they say, no, I've never been a victim of a crime. Right? Maybe they don't want to report. They don't report. So that is our National Crime Victimization Survey. We also have self-reporting statistics. These stats that are reported by the individuals themselves. These self-reporting, they get surveys, they get gathered when people are asked to report the number of times they may have committed a particular crime during a set period in the past, regardless of getting caught or not. So this is focusing on offender conduct, not a victim. This is the offenders. So the assumption is that the folks answering these self-reporting surveys are candid because they are anonymous. The point is to measure crimes that would neither be reported to the police nor show up in any victim surveys. And a prime example is like using illegal substances. The point of doing this survey is to reach the quote-unquote dark figures, the ones they can't quite get to, the statistics that can't be met. And these are mostly administered in schools because that's where attendance is universal and represents a cross-section of the community. But it's not restricted to that, but that's where they mostly happen. And it's usually conducted annually. And the question becomes, how valid are they? Are there any limitations? Can it be exaggerated? Again, like our victims, can it be exaggerated, the conduct, or underreported criminal behavior? Now we're asking about folks who've been involved in criminal behavior, whether it's reported or not, or arrested or not. And like I said, a lot of this is happening in schools, so we're dealing with students, and they might not even know what they've done was a crime, or something was a crime. Also, doing these surveys, you may not get a large enough sample, or you only focus on drugs versus suspension or some other area of law. And some may not cooperate at all. They don't want to cooperate in the survey. Can these surveys be monitored more effectively? Is a question. If used in a consistent fashion, which, as I pointed out, they do this annually with students. It's not restricted there. There's a couple different approaches that are used in attempting to keep them consistent, the surveys consistent. The longitudinal approach, which is what a lot of surveys are. We'll talk about some more surveys that are done this way, where you use the same sample group over a long period of time, right? You take a group of middle schoolers and you follow them all the way from middle school all the way up to high school. So you use the same sample group over a period of time to get a particular result, or to see what the results would be based on using the same group. The other way is to consistently do the same survey with different group subjects over time. So you're not just using students. You may use a different type of pattern, or maybe you're using a group of middle school students, and then junior high, and then high school students. And you're measuring the same thing, like drug abuse. Measure the same trend. So consistency is another way to use these surveys in a more consistent fashion. But overall, the information compares with the other surveys, that the other survey that we just talked about, and the National Incident-Based Reporting System, and the FBI's Uniform Crime Report. All of these things criminologists use. These are the primary ones, the primary sources that criminologists use in order to create and review trends and use data in creating their information for trends in crime and crime rates and so forth. And we're going to be, in a little bit, moving on to trends and patterns, that what comes of this information that they have seen, that comes out of this information after studying it for a period of time. So let's talk about these sources and evaluating them. This slide, evaluating strengths. The next slide is evaluating weaknesses, and then there's going to be a little chart. I'm going to do an overview of pros and cons right now, because as part of this week's assignment, so I want you to look at these strengths and these weaknesses and answer the questions in the assignment. So I have these here. Hopefully this will be helpful, along with the information in the book, to answer the questions. But I want to talk about pros and cons of crime data sources. Can statistics be misused? Happens all the time, right? Happens all the time. Whether intentionally or accidentally, the misuse of statistics promotes crime myths and generates fear of crime, right? Let's talk about the ways it can be misused. And here's the chart of all of those data collection methods put together for you to review and use in this week's assignment. But let's talk about ways that this information can be misused. Limiting public access to critical information. Right now, we're lucky. We live in the digital world. We have the internet and so forth, and all of this information is readily available at our fingertips. You're going to see that when you do this assignment and look at these sources on your own. But if the public has limited access to this critical information, it can lead to crime myths. People thinking that crime is out of control when it's not. Intending to mislead the public by presenting false information. Who does that? The media, right? Politicians. Using deceptive formats to present the information. Government officials. Organizations that may want to persuade an issue one way or the other. So these things can certainly get misused, and it happens all the time. So you need to be aware of that. When we talk more about ethics and criminologists, this is where this kind of plays a role, when this information is then taken to determine crime rate, crime patterns, crime trends, which we're going to jump into momentarily. So we just covered the official sources of crime data. The book on page 40 has other data that criminologists use for their studies. Review that as well. I'm not gonna. There's a whole bunch of them. I'm not gonna go through them all in a lecture on a video, because I think they're pretty well explained in that little. It's in a little section in your book passage. So now we are going to move on to crime trends and patterns.